Stars had always been quiet. For all of human history, people looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone else was out there. On a cold morning in December, they had their answer. One was drinking her second cup of coffee when the call came through. She had been awake since 4 in the morning, reviewing budget reports at the United Earth Defense Force headquarters in Virginia. The job was mostly paperwork these days. The Defense Force existed to prepare for threats that most people believed would never come. Voice on the phone belonged to General. He spoke only 4 words before hanging up. They found us. It was in the waiting room within 15 minutes. The screen showed satellite footage of objects entering the solar system near Jupiter. There were hundreds of them, then thousands. By the time sat down, the count had reached 300 large vessels and countless small craft surrounding them like clouds of insects. Amy stood at the main display, her face pale under the blue light of the monitors. She was the lead scientist on the early warning project, one who had spent 20 years preparing for the exact moment. Her hands were shaking. "Are not hiding," Amy said. "They want us to see them coming." Fleet moved fast. Within 6 hours, they had crossed the distance from Jupiter to Mars. Within 12 hours, they were close enough for Earth's telescopes to capture clear images. The ships were black and angular, covered in symbols that no one could read. They looked like weapons given form. First transmission came at exactly noon, Eastern Standard Time. Every screen on Earth flickered and showed the same image. A creature that stood 8 feet tall with gray skin stretched tight over sharp bones. Its eyes were pure black, and when it spoke, the words came through in perfect English. "Overlord of the Empire, we have conquered 43 species across the galaxy. Your world is now claimed. You will surrender all governments, all militaries, and all resistant within 72 hours. Those who comply will serve the Empire. Those who resist will be erased." Transmission showed images after that, cities burning on alien worlds, species that humanity had never seen before working in chains under masters, mass graves stretching to the horizon. The message was clear. This had happened before. It would happen again. The broadcast from the situation room. Around her, officers and analysts sat in stunned silence. Some were crying, others were praying. A young lieutenant in the corner was calling his mother. Len entered the room and walked straight to. He was a large man with gray hair and steady hands. He had fought in 3 wars during his career. Nothing had prepared him for this. "What do we do?" he asked. At the screen, at the image of Frozen in mid-speech. She thought about her daughter, who was 12 years old and probably watching the same broadcast from her school in Maryland. She thought about every person on the planet who was looking up at the sky right now, wondering if tomorrow would come. "We fight," he said. Next 48 hours were chaos. World leaders held emergency meeting. The United Nations passed resolution. Religious leaders called for peace. Protesters filled the streets of every major city, some demanding surrender and others demanding war. The scenes activated Project Blackout. It was a network of satellite weapons and ground-based defenses that had been built in secret over the past 30 years. Every major nation had contributed to it, setting aside their differences for the one threat that could unite them all. The project had never been tested against a real enemy. No one knew if it would work. Amy worked without sleep. Her team analyzed every piece of data they could gather about the ships. They studied the energy signatures, the movement patterns, the communication frequencies. Amy was looking for a weakness, any weakness that might give humanity a chance. The same day, he found something. The shields operated on a specific frequency. They were designed to stop energy weapons, plasma bursts, and nuclear explosion. But they had gaps, small gaps that might allow physical projectiles to pass through at the right angle and speed. It was not much, but it was something. 72 hours ended at noon on the 3rd day. Appeared on every screen again, his black eyes showing something that might have been amusement. "Time has ended," he said. "What is your answer, humans?" In front of the camera at the United Earth Defense Force headquarters, she was wearing her dress uniform, the one she saved for ceremonies and funerals. Behind her stood representatives from every nation on Earth. They had argued for 2 days about what to say. In the end, they agreed on a simple message. Directly into the camera, she thought about her daughter again. She thought about every human who had ever lived and died on this small blue planet. She thought about what it meant to be human, to face impossible odds and refuse to kneel. "We declined," she said. It was a moment of silence, then laughed. It was a terrible sound like metal scraping against stone. "And you will die," he said, "all of you." Transmission ended. In orbit above Earth, 300 warships began to move into attack formation. Weapon systems that could crack continents powered up. Fighter craft by the thousands launched from their base. To General, he was already on the phone, giving orders to bases around the world. Pilots were running to their aircraft. Submarines were diving to attack depth. Soldiers were chaining their weapons and saying goodbye to their families. Invasion had begun. They had made a mistake. They had studied human technology and found it primitive. They had studied human history and found it violent and chaotic. They had looked at the small species on its time plan and seen nothing but ease prey. They had not understood what that violent meant. They had not grasped what chaos could become when focused toward a single purpose. They had never faced a species that had spent its entire existence fighting against impossible odds simply because giving up was not in its nature. They were about to learn. The first wave came at dawn. 1,000 fires descended on Earth like a swarm of locusts. Their engines screamed through the atmosphere as they raced toward the major cities. New York, London, Beijing, Moscow, Tokyo. The alien planned to break humanity's spirit by destroying its greatest achievements in a single morning. Jake was already in the air when the attack began. He flew an F-45 Phantom out of Edwards Air Force Base in California, one of only 200 pilots in the world qualified to operate the experimental interceptor. The aircraft was fast and deadly, built using every secret technology that humanity had developed over the past 50 years. It was the best weapon Earth had. It was not enough. Squadron number 12 aircraft. They faced nearly 100 enemy fighters heading toward Los Angeles alone. The math was simple and brutal. Every pilot knew they were not expected to survive. Wingman was Captain Lise Park, a woman from Chicago who had joined the Air Force 10 years ago because she wanted to see the world. Now she was seeing things no human had ever witnessed. The fighters were sleek and fast, moving through the sky like nothing bound by normal physics. "We have contact in 30 seconds," she said over the radio. "What is the plan?" Checked his weapons. He had 8 missiles and 3,000 rounds of ammunition. The ships had shields that could stop most of what he carried. "Get close," he said. "We find out what hurts them." Forces met over the Pacific Ocean, 50 miles from the California coast. Jake fired his first missile at the lead enemy fighter and watched it explode harmlessly against the alien shields. The return fire with energy weapons that turned 2 of his squadron mates into balls of flame in less than a second. Jake did not retreat. He pushed his throttle forward and flew directly at the enemy formation. Had never seen that before. Every species they had conquered valued survival above all else. When faced with superior firepower, they ran or surrendered. They did not charge headlong into certain death. It was close enough to see the alien pilot through the cockpit window when he fired his cannon. The rounds were simple metal, moving at tremendous speed. They passed through the gaps in the enemy shields the doctor had discovered and tore the fire apart from the inside. Alien ship exploded. Jake flew through the fireball and came out the other side, his aircraft scorched but still flying. Orcs, he shouted into his radio, "Get close and use your guns. The shields have gaps." Message spread across the global defense network in seconds. Pilots around the world heard the words and understood what they meant. They could hurt the enemy. They could win. All they had to do was get close enough to die trying. New York, a squadron of F-35s flew into the heart of an enemy formation. They lost 8 aircraft in the first pass but destroyed 12 fires. Over London, a pilot named Tom Bailey rammed his damaged jet directly into an alien bomber that was heading for Portland. The explosion took out 3 enemy ships. Moscow, a group of pilots who had been enemies just days ago flew side by side, speaking different languages but fighting for the same cause. They died together, and they took their kills with them. Noon, humanity had lost 200 aircraft and nearly that many pilots, but they had lost 3,000 fires. The first wave had failed. The command ship, Overlord, stared at the reports with something he had never felt before. It was not quite fear. He had conquered too many worlds to know true fear, but it was close. Was it possible he'd meant it? They are primitives. Their technology is centuries behind ours. Tactical officer had no answer. The numbers did not make sense. No species should be willing to die at such rates for such small gains. The humans were not fighting to win. They were fighting to hurt them, even if it cost them everything. Colorado, Dr. Amy worked through the chaos. Pieces of destroyed fires had fallen across the planet, and her teams were collecting every fragment they could find. She examined the alien technology with hands that trembled from exhaustion and excitement. Shields, but they relied on them completely. Their armor beneath was thin. Their weapons were powerful but slow to recharge. Their pilots were skilled but predictable, following patterns that never changed because they had never needed to adapt. Transmitted her findings to every military base on Earth. She told them where to aim, when to fire, and how to predict any movements. She gave humanity a fighting chance. The sun set on the first day of the invasion. Jake landed his damaged aircraft at what remained of Edwards Air Force Base. Half the runway was cratered. The control tower was burning. Bodies were being carried away under white sheets. His Park was waiting for him on the tarmac. Her aircraft had taken a direct hit during the battle, but she had managed to land safely. Her face was covered in soot and her left arm was bandaged, but she was alive. Lost 40% of the squadron, he said, but we stopped them. The city is still standing. Look west, toward Los Angeles. He could see smoke rising from a few places where any fire had gotten through, but the skyline was intact. Millions of people were still alive because 12 pilots had been willing to die for them. How many did we get, he asked. He almost smiled. Over 200 confirmed kills just from our group. The enemy is pulling back to regroup. Above the Earth, the fleet hung in orbit like a dark cloud, was planning his next move, trying to understand an enemy that everything he knew about warfare. He had more ships, more weapons, more soldiers. He could glass the entire planet if he chose. That was not conquest, that was destruction, and needed slaves, not ashes. Send the ground force next. His soldiers would land in the cities and break the human resistance face to face. No species had ever stood against warrior in close combat. These humans would be no different. Or so he believed. Earth Admiral received reports from around the world. The losses were staggering, but they had survived the first day. They had proven that the invaders could bleed. Humanity was just getting started. Look at the tactical display showing any positions and movement pattern. They were preparing for a ground assault. They would send troops to occupy the major cities, expecting the humans to crumble under the pressure of alien soldiers walking their streets. They were in for a surprise. Need to arm the civilians, General said. Every person who can hold a weapon. The enemy thinks they are invading a planet. They are walking into a trap. The second day was coming, and with it, a kind of war they had never imagined. Send it on Los Angeles at sunrise. There were hundreds of them, each carrying 50 soldiers armed with weapons that could melt steel and armor that could stop any bullet. Overlord had ordered the ground invasion personally, confident that his warriors would crush whoever resisted the humans offered. Danny watched the ship land from the roof of an apartment building in East Los Angeles. He was 30 years old, a veteran of 2 tours overseas, and he had been fighting one war or another since he was 19. Nothing had prepared him for this. On him stood 40 civilians armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, and pistols. They were teachers and mechanics and store clerks, people who had never fired a weapon in anger. But when Danny had asked for volunteers, they had come. Every single one of them. For what I told you, Danny said, do not engage them head-on, hit them and move. Make them bleed and disappear. We are not trying to win a battle. We are trying to make them afraid. First patrol entered the neighborhood an hour later. The soldiers were tall and thin, their gray skin hidden under black armor. They moved with confidence, expecting no resistance. On every other world they had conquered, the population had hidden and trembled as the warriors passed. Rifle shot cracked from a third-floor window. The bullet punched through a gap in the lead soldier's helmet and dropped him in the street. Before his body hit the ground, 3 more shots came from different directions. 2 more soldiers fell. Turned fire, reducing the window to roll. But the shooter was already gone, running through a hole in the wall that led to the next building and then to the sewers below. Pattern repeated across the city. Every time they turned a corner, they faced gunfire from the shadows. Every time they pursued, the attackers vanished into a maze of buildings and tunnels and hidden passages. The aliens had maps of the city, but the maps did not show the secret paths that humans had been creating since they arrived. At noon they had taken 6 blocks. They had lost a soldier. Mario Santos crouched in a basement beneath a burned-out church, guarding the most valuable prisoner the resistance had captured. He was a warrior, wounded in the leg and stripped of his weapons. His black eyes watched her with a mixture of hatred and confusion. She spoke 6 languages. She had spent the last 3 years working as a military translator. Now she was trying to learn a set. You fight, the prisoner asked. His English was rough but understandable. You cannot win. The Empire has never been defeated. Stayed him for a long moment. She thought about her grandmother, who had survived a civil war. She thought about her father, who had worked 3 jobs so his children could go to college. She thought about every human who had ever struggled against impossible odds simply because the alternative was unthinkable. Because we do not know how to stop, she said. The prisoner made a sound that might have been laughter. You are insane, all of you. Mari leaned closer. But you're afraid. I can see it. Your people have never lost a war. You do not know what to do when the enemy refuses to break. It was right. They had built their entire civilization on conquest. Their military strategy, their economy, their social structure, everything depended on victory. They had protocols for accepting surrender. They had procedures for manning slave populations. They had no contingency for an enemy that simply would not quit. The flagship received reports from ground commanders across the planet. The story was the same everywhere. Casualties mounting. Progress stalling. Soldiers reporting that the humans attacked from everywhere and nowhere, using weapons that should have been useless against armor but somehow found the gaps every time. Back the ground forces ordered, we will use the ships. Overlord, his tactical officer approached it. The fleet is vulnerable in low orbit. The humans have submarines carrying nuclear weapons. Destroy the submarines, snarled. Destroy their navies. Destroy anything that floats. It was the decision Admiral had been waiting for. The fleet descended toward the oceans, their sensors searching for human vessel. They found them easily. Submarines were slow and noisy compared to deck technology. The aliens locked weapons on dozens of targets. They never saw the torpedoes coming. They were not standard nuclear warheads. Dr. Amy had modified them based on her analysis of shields. The torpedoes carried dense metal slugs propelled by nuclear explosion, reaching speeds that no conventional weapon could match. They hit the alien ship before the shields could adjust to the kinetic threat. Manned ships exploded in orbit. The fire was visible from the ground, blooming across the sky like new suns. Across the planet, humans looked up and cheered. For the first time since the invasion began, they saw proof that the enemy could be hurt badly. Watched his ship burn from the bridge of his flagship. The screen showed damage reports, casualty lists, and something he had never seen in any conquest before, a tactical advantage. He whispered, how are they doing this? The science officer brought the answer. The humans adapted, Overlord. They studied our technology and found weaknesses we did not know existed. They are learning faster than any species we have encountered. Look at the blue plant filling his viewport. He thought about the 43 species he had crushed beneath his boots. They had been intelligent. They had been advanced. But none of them had possessed whatever madness drove these creatures to throw themselves against impossible odds again and again. He had two choices. He could continue the invasion and lose more ships, more soldiers, more time. Or he could end the threat permanently. Activate the planet killers, he said. The officers froze. The planet killer weapons were designed for worlds that could not be conquered. Worlds that needed to be erased entirely. Using them meant admitting defeat. It meant destroying billions of potential slaves. It meant telling the Empire that the mighty had faced a species they could not break. It saw no other option. These humans were too dangerous to control. Better to burn them all than risk letting even one of them live. Colorado, Dr. Amy detected the energy buildup on her instruments. She calculated the power levels and realized what was coming. They were going to sterilize Earth. It had 18 hours to find a way to stop them. Somewhere in the ruins of Lowe's Angels, Danny looked up at the sky and understood that the real battle was just beginning. Amy stood in the command center with dark circles under her eyes and terror in her heart. The screen showed energy readings from the fleet that climbed higher every minute. In 18 hours, those weapons would flare. In 18 hours, everything humanity had ever built would turn to ash. Admiral and General stood beside her studying the data. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. They had fought harder than anyone believed possible, and it was not enough. There has to be a way, he finally said. We cannot have come this far just to lose. He pointed at the display. The planet killers are charging aboard the battleships. Our weapons cannot reach them in time. Even if we launched every nuclear missile on Earth, the shields would stop them before they get close. What about getting close? Asked. You said the shields have gaps for physical objects at the speed. He shook her head. A missile is too slow. It would need to be something faster. Something that could breach the shields before they could adjust. Like a ship, said quietly. The room went silent. Everyone understood what she was suggesting. A direct assault. Human vessels flying into the heart of the enemy fleet, not to fire weapons, but to board, to fight the hand-to-hand in the quarters of their own ships. It would be suicide, said. Looked at him, so was everything else we have done, but we are still here. Call went out within the hour. Every spacecraft that could reach orbit was needed. Military vessels, cargo ships, modified passenger planes, experimental rockets, anything that could carry soldiers into space, anything that could breach a hull. 1,000 soldiers volunteered. They knew the odds. They knew most of them would never come home. They came anyway. Nick was among the first to sign up. His wounds from the air battle were still healing, but he refused to stay behind. Lisa Park stood beside him in the briefing room, her arm still bandaged from her crash landing days ago. You do not have to do this, she said. You have done enough. He thought about his parents in Ohio, who had called him crying after the first battle. He thought about his sister, who had sent him a message telling him she was proud of him. He thought about every person on Earth who was counting on them to find a way to survive. None of us have done enough, he said. Not until this is over. Fleet launched at midnight. 300 vessels rose from bases around the world, climbing through the atmosphere toward the stars. They were not warships. They were garbage trucks and fuel tankers and anything else that could be pressurized and armed. They carried soldiers in cargo holds designed for supplies, not people. He sat in the belly of a converted transport plane, his rifle across his knees. Around him were 90 soldiers from a dozen different countries. They had been enemies once. Now they were brothers. Santos was beside him, checking her equipment for the 10th time. She had demanded to come, arguing that her language skills might be useful. Danny suspected she just refused to let others fight while she stayed safe. Detected the human fleet within minutes of launch, watched the tiny ships climbing toward his armada and felt something he could not name. These creatures knew they were facing extinction. They knew they could not win, and yet they came anyway. Destroy them, he ordered. Fire swarmed out to meet the human assault. They had overwhelming numbers and superior weapons. They expected to end the battle before it began. The human ships did not fight like a fleet. They scattered in every direction, each vessel choosing its own path through the chaos. They dodged and weaved and sacrificed themselves to protect their neighbor. They flew patterns that made no tactical sense because they were not trying to win a battle. They were trying to reach the enemy ship by any means necessary. Piloted his craft through a wall of fire. Energy weapons scorched his hull and killed the soldiers in the compartment behind him. He kept flying. An enemy fire rammed his wing and sent him spinning. He stabilized and kept flying. A direct hit destroyed his engines, and he used the last of his momentum to crash through the hull of a battleship. Impact threw him forward against his restraints. Alarm screamed. Smoke filled the cockpit, but through the shattered he could see the interior of an alien vessel. He was inside. Across the fleet, similar scenes played out. Human ships rammed into hulls, breaching airlocks and cargo bays and engineering sections. Soldiers poured out with weapons blazing, charging into corridors that no human had ever walked. Were not prepared for this. Their combat doctrine assumed that battles happened at a distance, where their superior technology mattered. They had never trained for close quarters fighting. They had never needed to. And his team fought through the corridors of a battleship, room by room. The aliens were tall and strong, but they moved slowly and predictably. They relied on their weapons, and when those weapons failed in tight spaces, they did not know what to do. Warrior swung at Dane with an armored fist. Dane ducked under the blow and drove his knife into the gap between the alien's helmet and armor. The creature fell. A week, Mari shed over the gunfire. Without their technology, they are nothing. It was true. They had built their empire on fear and firepower. They had forgotten how to fight like cornered animals, like creatures with nothing left to lose. They had never faced an enemy that would rather die standing than live on its knees. He led his surviving crew through the flagship, following signs that Mari had translated during her interrogation of the prisoner. They were heading for the bridge. They were heading for himself. Hours passed in blood and fire. Human soldiers fell by the hundreds, but they fell faster. Ship by ship, the fleet was being torn apart from the inside. We monitored the battle from Earth, watching the energy readings on the planet killers. 15 hours until they fired. Then 12. Then 10. The numbers climbed slower as crews abandoned their posts to fight the invaders. 8 hours, the first battleship went dark. Its power core overloaded when human soldiers reached engineering and refused to stop fighting even when the room filled with radiation. The ship exploded, taking 1,000 enemies with it. 6 hours, 3 more ships fell. At 4 hours, the fleet was in chaos. Jake finally reached the bridge of the flagship, where Overlord stood with a weapon in his hand and fear in his black eyes. Human was bleeding from a dozen wounds. His armor was cracked. His rifle was empty. He held only a combat knife that looked like a toy against the alien's massive gun. Cannot win said, even if you kill me, the Empire will send more fleets. We will never stop. He smiled through the blood on his face. Neither will we. He moved before could fire. Fight lasted 30 seconds. Fired his weapon, and the energy blast scorched the wall where Jake had been standing a moment before. But Jake was no longer there. He had thrown himself forward the instant he saw the alien's finger twitch. Tall and strong, he had conquered worlds. He had crushed species beneath his armored boots, but he had never fought a human in close combat. He had never faced a creature that had evolved on a planet where death lurked in every shadow, where survival meant being faster and meaner than everything else. Drove his knife into the gap beneath the alien's arm, screamed and dropped his weapon. Jake pulled the blade free and struck again, this time at the throat. The Overlord fell backward against his command chair, dark blood pouring from wounds that should have been impossible. Aghast, you are primitive, you should not exist. Stood over him, breathing hard. His vision was blurring from blood loss. He could hear gunfire echoing through the corridors as his team held back the guards trying to reach the bridge. "I'm not primitives," he said. "We are survivors, and your empire made the mistake of trying to take our home." With his black eyes open, staring at the human who had destroyed everything he believed about the universe. The bridge of the flagship, Jake found the controls that Amy had described. The planet killer weapons were still charting, still counting down toward the moment when Earth would burn. He did not understand the alien symbols, but Mari had taught him which buttons to press. Shut them down. One by one, the weapons powered off. The countdown stopped at 2 hours and 17 minutes. Collapsed against the console and laughed. It was a weak sound, barely more than a wheeze, but it was the laughter of a man who had just saved his world. I'll rage for another 16 hours. Human soldiers fought through the fleet ship by ship, quarter by quarter. They cleared engineering sections and weapon bays and crew quarters. They took no prisoners because they could not afford to guard them. They showed no mercy because none had been offered to them. Led his team through the final stronghold on the battleship they had boarded. The defenders fought hard, but they were leaderless and confused. Word had spread that was dead. The chain of command was broken. Santos walked beside Dang, her rifle raised. She had killed more enemies than she could count. Her hands were steady, but her heart ached for every life taken, even alien lives. She was not a soldier by nature. She was a linguist, a one who believed in communication and understanding. Some enemies could not be reasoned with. Some threats could only be answered with force. Last ship fell as the sun rose over the Atlantic Ocean. Admiral watched the final explosion from the command center in Virginia. Tears streamed down her face. Around her, officers and analysts were cheering and hugging each other. Earl stood beside her, his face gray with exhaustion. "We did it," he said. "Somehow we actually did it." Her head, "They did it. The pilots and soldiers who gave everything. We just gave them the chance." Cost was staggering. Of the 12,000 soldiers who had launched in space, fewer than 3,000 returned. Thousands more had died in the air battles and ground fighting. Cities around the world had been damaged or destroyed. The scars would take generations to heal. Humanity had survived. More than survived, they had won. Main ships tried to flee. Some were destroyed by the satellite weapons that Amy had calibrated to their shield frequencies. Others were hunted down by the handful of human fighters still able to fly. Not a single alien vessel escaped to warn the Empire. A month after first contact, the invasion was over. The fleet that had conquered 43 species had been completely wiped out by a primitive world that refused to surrender. He woke up in a hospital bed in California. His wounds had been severe, and the doctors had not expected him to survive. But he was human, and humans had a habit of surviving things they should not. Park was waiting when he opened his eyes. She looked tired and thin, but she was smiling. "I'm back," she said. "You missed the parade." He tried to laugh and winced at the pain. "What parade?" "Where they named you a hero. You and everyone else who flew that mission." Lisa took his hand. "The whole world knows what you did." He thought about the soldiers who had died beside him. The pilots who had crashed their ships in any hulls. The men and women who had fought in corridors filled with smoke and fire, knowing they would never see their families again. "We're the heroes," he said quietly. "I just happened to survive." The months that followed, humanity began to rebuild. They buried their dead and tended their wounded. They repaired their cities and mourned their losses. But they also looked up at the stars with new eyes. Where Amy led the team that studied the captured technology. Within a year, human engineers had begun to adapt alien systems to their own designs. Within 5 years, humanity had built its first true starship. Within 10, they had a fleet. Pyre eventually sent scouts to learn what had happened to their invading force. They found a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable star, just as their records described. But the planet was different now. Satellites armed with weapons they had never seen orbit in precise formation. Ships patrolled the outer system, watching for threats. Scouts reported back to their masters. They described a species that had taken the technology of their conquerors and improved upon it. A species that had unified in the face of extinction and never fractured again. A species that was no longer trapped on its, waiting to be found. Pyre had a name for worlds like Earth. They called them places so hostile that any life surviving there was forged in constant struggle. The species that emerged from such worlds were rare and dangerous. Decided that the resources required to conquer Earth were not worth the cost. They from that sector of space entirely, leaving a wide buffer zone around the system that had destroyed their fleet. Species in the galaxy heard the story. They heard about the primitives who had faced an invasion and wiped out the invaders completely. They heard about the soldiers who had rammed their ships into any hulls. They heard about the pilot who had killed an overlord with a knife. They learned a lesson that the universe would not forget. Humanity was not prey. Humanity was not a species to be conquered. Humanity was a warning, carved in the wreckage of a fleet that had thought itself invincible. Now come to Earth looking for slaves. The people there do not kneel. The people there do not break. The people there will fight until their last breath and make you pay for every inch of ground. Galaxy had many names for such creatures, but the humans had only one name for themselves. Survivors. And now the stars knew it too.